Dr. Susan Pinco, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, David. I'm excited to be here with you.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. Actually, you were recommended to me by my previous guest, who I'm sure you know, Betty Betty Friedson. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And the thing that really got me hooked on interviewing you is that among the many other approaches that you use, you've kind of specialized in brain spotting. And I know nothing about that approach. And so, and I've been in this realm for a long time. So what's something I don't know about? I think I heard the term once before. So this is going to be a good opportunity to bring me up to date, get me all educated. And I'm sure our audience will appreciate that as well. Maybe we can begin by having you take us through your educational and professional background.
Okay. I love to tell the story of when I was young. I wanted to be an interior decorator until I was 13. And then at 13, I decided I'm working with different interiors, as in the psyche. And I come
now
from...
What happened at 13 because that sounds a very different, sounds like something dramatic must have happened to shift that orientation.
I grew up in a family of therapists, and what happened really was I was talking to one of my best friends, and he was opening his heart to me and telling me how much he was struggling with something, and he thought it was XYZ. I don't even remember specifically what it was, but I said, "Are you sure it isn't this?" And he said, "You're right." And I said, "Oh, okay. Maybe I should follow in my family's footsteps." So I, from that point on, wanted to be a therapist.
Wow. And that's such an early age, but growing up in a therapist family, I could see, I didn't grow up in a therapist family, but I've raised one. And none of them have become therapists. Oh, actually, that's not right. I do have a son who is a nurse practitioner, adult son, and he's doing psychedelic assisted therapy. So he
Fabulous.
He has kind of followed in the footsteps to some degree. And so I interrupted you at 13. You were telling us about your educational and professional background.
So I went to a school that was predominantly pre-med, and psych was a lab science. I did not want to work with the rhesus monkeys. So having a joint degree in psych, soc, and anthro, I went to the psych department, and said, "Write me a recommendation." They said no, because you didn't do all our lab sciences. And so I got into Columbia Clinical Social Work program, which was actually an alma mater of my aunt's, and graduated from there, practiced for quite a number of years, and then went back and got my PhD in somatic psychology.
And where did you get that? There aren't too many places that offer that.
I went to a place that allowed me to create my own curriculum, which is International School of Graduate Studies. And so they took all of my continuing ed, which is voluminous, and allowed me to craft my research project and my doctoral dissertation. I did that and took 3.5 years of research and writing and graduated.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on that. And so then take us through your professional migration, if you will.
Well, so I was really lucky when I finished graduate school that I got a job at a community mental health clinic that was very much like being in private practice. And I had some phenomenal supervisors who at the time were involved with hypnosis and transactional analysis. And we even had a psychiatrist who in that day, which was a long time ago, recognized multiple personality disorder. And so I had an amazing training there. And then left there got involved in operations and management consulting so that I could bring a more rounded skill set to healthcare. And when I got off the road, I started up my private practice again. And the rest is history. Well, the history forward into 9/11 and how our field saw its limitations in treating trauma, and that telling stories was not nearly as helpful as creating healing experiences.
Mhm.
And as part of that journey, I took EMDR, which is where I met Dr. Grant, who developed Brainspotting.
Okay.
And and also because of my work with David and the way that Brainspotting creates a holding environment for our systems to emerge from unbearable aloneness into a state where you actually can transform at a neurophysiological level things that have gotten stuck in our systems, which then led me to my doctoral thesis, which initially, before I got talked out of it, the title was Debunking the Myth of the Talking Cure.
Uh-huh.
And they talked me out of that. They thought there was a little bit too much hubris in that. So it became, is it the talking that cures? A look at the role of silence and language in psychotherapy and healing.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that you met Dr. Grant, David Grant, is it?
Grand, yes.
Oh, Grand. And he's the founder of Brainspotting. Now, was he a student along with you in that EMDR or was he the person teaching it or what?
He was facilitating the class, and he had actually developed a program called Natural Flow EMDR, because EMDR, at least in its initial days, was very structured and protocolized. And when you were working with someone and doing the eye movements with them, if the person stopped tracking with their eyes, that was something wrong. And what David discovered, and I can tell you about the origins of Brainspotting in a little bit, but what David discovered is that actually hanging out there where the eye jumps back to where it was rather than following the pointer actually opens the door to immense and very deep healing.
Fascinating. So you, sounds like you have more to say about how Brainspotting got started and evolved.
Absolutely. I'm happy to share that. So David was working with a young figure skater who had a series of sports injuries. She had a lot of attachment issues. Her parents had gone through a horrible divorce. David had been working with her once a week for 90 minutes over the course of a year. And come this day, I don't remember the specific day that it was, but the particular day that we're talking about, she could not do a triple Lutz. Now, we mere mortal can't do a triple Lutz if we want to, but it supposedly is a relatively simple jump where you go up in the air and go around 3 times and come down. And if you are tensing or choking in the middle of it, then you'll pop out of the jump before it's completed. And she was doing that repeatedly and could not make the 3rd turn without coming back down onto the ice. So David was working with her on this moment where she lost the jump. And he noticed as he was going across that it felt as if somebody had reached out and just grabbed his hand. And so he stopped. And as he sat there holding this fixed visual point with this young lady, a torrent of material came out that they both thought had been processed already down to a 0. And if you're familiar with EMDR and trauma processing, there's a scale of 0 to 10 with how upsetting things are. And the goal is to get to the point where memories are just memories, they're not triggering. And so all these things they had thought had no longer been triggering memories. But in fact, as they're sitting on this point, a rush of emotion came up and these memories came back for her. And they seemed to process down to an even deeper level. And after that session, this young lady went out on the ice and performed a flawless triple Lutz and never had that issue again. So David came back. I was in supervision with him at that time with a group of other people. David came back and told us about this session and then had us try doing an equivalent sort of process. And we all really loved it and went back and started trying it with our own clients. And over time, started coming up with different ways that we could teach people to do this process with their clients. And it's been an incredible journey since 2003. There, I think, are over 15,000 therapists trained worldwide.
Wow.
We're in
That's
many,
a
many
large
countries.
number. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a very short period of time. So you were there actually right at the dawn of this. You were in on it at the ground floor.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to make sure that I understand, I think your explanation was very clear, but just to make sure everybody's on board with us, he was doing an EMDR protocol with her of moving his hand back and forth and having her eyes track his hand. And then when he noticed that she stopped at a certain place, then he began to work with his hand from that place.
Exactly.
To move it deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So initially, David, I don't think he had the rational thought around it. It was more a visceral sense that this is what he should be doing in the moment. And it was pay dirt.
Pay dirt. Yeah.
Pay dirt. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like it. Now I'm under the impression that, well, I should ask you, is this the main thing that you do in your clinical work, or is this part of a whole collection of techniques that you've gathered or approaches?
It's in a collection of techniques that I've gathered. I am at heart an Ericksonian, so I use a lot of metaphor. I'm very conscious of how I use my voice. I am very conscious of the presupposition that, yes, people can change, they can heal. And so I would say Ericksonian hypnosis is the cornerstone of my work. And then with that are some other somatically oriented therapies. So there's somatic experiencing, there's focusing, I use ego state work. At the heart of everything that I do is an effort to make the work experiential, not cognitive. Now what we talk about when we talk about brain spotting is that it is at heart a stance. So it's not just a series of techniques or a process that we follow. We start with being neurobiologically attuned, or dual attunement, which means that we are attuning to what's happening externally with someone physiologically. So as I'm talking to you, I'm noticing the way that your breath is changing. I noticed how your head just canted to the side, right? And I am curious about what's happening in the rest of your being. I am also, as part of this process, when I'm working with clients, helping them to attune to themselves too. Because one of the biggest challenges I've found almost universally is that people are not very compassionate with themselves. No matter how compassionate they are with other people, they really have a hard time being compassionate with themselves. So brain spotting is a beautiful way of introducing people to that concept of compassion and observation. Layered on top of that is this process of pairing a visual focal point, which includes a visceral orientation to a particular spot that appears to amplify the felt sense of connection to whatever it is that we're working on.
How do you find that spot?
So you can find it in a couple of different ways. You might find it if someone is just talking and you notice that their eyes are going to and staying at a particular place, and that's what we call a gaze spot. Or we might do it with a process of the therapist noticing more reflexive responses. So someone looking to the left might have a lot more blinks and changes in posture, and that they're much stiller over here, or over here, or over here. That would be in what we call outside window. Inside window would be a perceived sense of what the right spot is. And so we ask people to just notice, looking left, center, and right, where they have more of a felt sense of connection. And then we zero in on the specific location. Now, what's interesting, and then I'll be quiet and let you ask more questions. I have many clients will say to me, "Oh, this is weird, and I don't think there's a right spot, or how am I going to know?" And then I'm over here with the pointer, and they say, "Oh no, so move it a quarter of an inch to the right." Oh, that's right. So it's
the very person who is skeptical suddenly has a sense of it.
Yes. Yeah. And when I'm teaching, the biggest shift in the room happens when we do the first practice, because everyone in the room has an experience of, oh, this is what it's about. And
so you're teaching in a group of therapists who are wanting to develop this technique. And how large a group is it typically that you're able to do this with?
We do it anywhere from 15 to 150 usually.
So that's pretty remarkable that you can have 150 people who have this experience.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's experience is believing with this, very much so.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm of that school as well. It's hard to extend to oneself, really, if you haven't had a taste of what it is that you're trying to do.
Right.
Yeah. And so talk a bit more about the attunement. I'm not sure what more you can say. Attunement isn't a super precise sounding word. It could sound a little woo-woo. So the more that you can ground us in it, that would be helpful.
So it's so interesting. If maybe I can take a step back and talk about Dan Siegel for a second. So okay. I was at an Evolution of Psychotherapy conference, and Dan was up on stage, and he had invited somebody to come and be a demo subject. He welcomed them, had them sit down, and then he turned his back to them. And he talked to the audience for about a minute and a half. And then he turned back to the person and said, "So how are you doing?" And the person was quaking. They were so destabilized because there was no connection between the two of them. So when I think about attunement and how important attunement is in regulation and in people's capacity to meet things that are difficult inside themselves, I can't overstate. First of all, it begins with the eyes. Right. And so I might be looking at someone, right? And as I'm looking at you, I can see how you're taking in what I'm saying, how you're thinking about it, how, as I'm speaking, my words are resonating with you. And so I'm attuning to the small movements you're making to your head.
Okay.
Right. I'm attuning to what's happening with your breathing. I'm actually starting to match your breathing. You may or may not be aware of that. And I'm not doing that consciously. Physiologically, my body is attuning to yours. And so what happens, I think, with a lot of the more traditional therapies is that we have been inculcated into the process of having to be the interpreter, the diagnostician, the fixer, right?
Yeah.
And so we're so busy thinking about what smart thing we're going to say or how we're going to direct
Right.
the process,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That we lose the connection. And so this way of working privileges the connection almost over anything else. You know, we talk about following in the tail of the comet, following the client, asking ourselves, why am I going to say that? Why am I talking? Right? What happens if I'm listening? What could I discover if I hold off speaking now?
Connection really stands out as key in what you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
because I was thinking it sounds like connection before you actually use that word. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that we know from a lot of psychotherapy research, that I think there's been a shifting, the gaze has been shifting in that
Mm-hmm.
direction more and more. One of the things that popped into my mind was, as aware, well, you and I are on Zoom right now, and maybe that
Mm-hmm.
limits, I don't know if that limits the connection or not. And a lot of therapists have had to shift their work because of COVID into working on Zoom or a similar platform. Are you doing that? And if so, do you find it limiting?
It's different. I don't know that I find that it's limiting per se. The what I can't do on Zoom is I can't stand up and sit next to somebody.
Okay.
All right. I can't pick an object, sit with someone and look in my space with them and say, okay, pick an object that connects you to what it is we're working with. And then is that object in the right place? And if it's not, walk me through moving it to where is the right place. So I have to adapt what I'm doing. And I might do similar things and have that person imagine me sitting next to them. I might have them look around their environment and pick something.
Right.
But in terms of connection, I find that it still is very much available and can be very profound.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, you mentioned getting up and sitting next to the person.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that physicality. And are there other physical elements that come into the connection?
I'm not sure what
is there touching? Is there?
So, our field prohibits that to a degree.
Yeah.
But depending upon who I'm working with, I have one client who I've sat on the couch with, and she's had horrific childhood trauma, and she will reach out and take my hand. And so we will have the session with her holding my hand.
Uh-huh.
I don't initiate it, but I'm available for it. And I think that sometimes that kind of grounding is critical.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, your training was in somatic therapies, and certainly
Right.
there have come to be limitations and rules that the field didn't start with, and there have been a lot of people who've done therapy that explicitly involves touch. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering about that part.
Well, yeah. So with SE, particularly the SE practitioners that have massage background, they do a fair amount of touch. You're right.
When you say SE, is sensory experiencing?
It's Peter Levine's somatic experiencing.
Somatic experiencing. Okay. Yeah.
Right. And so with Brainspotting, we do body spotting, and there's actually where you'll, let's say someone has a pain in their leg related to fibromyalgia. We might have them put their hand or put a pointer on the place of the pain and then focus their attention there. But that would be the person doing that for themselves, not the therapist doing it.
Yeah. There's one thing that might come up for people, what comes up in my mind is, well, there's so many therapies already. Do we really need another one?
It depends on what you're already doing. And again, I think anything that privileges connection, that teaches therapists how to slow down, to not have to be the smartest person in the room, to make space to follow the client, and unpacks, as you were asking before, about the neurophysiology and dual attunement. If we can train therapists how to do that, we're doing something that most other therapies don't teach. EMDR is about getting out of the frame. So they're not teaching that. And I can't honestly think of any other therapy that focuses in this particular area of connection the way that Brainspotting does. So I think for no other reason but that it's worth learning.
Okay.
How you integrate this into a practice is up to the therapist, clearly. But if you look at the work of Bessel van der Kolk or Stephen Porges, where they're talking about social engagement, they're talking about working below the words, below the story, understanding that our wonderful, bright neocortex has almost no effective connections to the limbic system and the brainstem, which are where all of the trauma is stored. And so you've got to come up with ways of accessing that system and helping it to reorganize. If you, and that could be one of a number of different approaches.
Is there,
No, go ahead.
Is there a condition that you would say this is particularly suited to? You've mentioned trauma a number of times.
So there's trauma, there's performance, the writer's block, there's the yips in golf. David does a lot of work with that. There's enhancing actors' ability. You could use this with almost anything. It really is more a stance than it is a technique.
So there could even be like specialties, like somebody who specializes in sports work.
Absolutely, there
sports
are.
Psychology, yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So I get what you're saying about it is a stance more than a technique, and kind of a belief system in a way, or that you're dedicated to a belief framework.
Right. Well, so my belief, which I think was substantiated by science, is that we have to make therapy experiential, and we have to help access the limbic system, the midbrain, the parts of us that are not part of the story.
Yeah.
And that how you do that is open. Brainspotting is extraordinarily effective for most things, unless you have a part of you that is so if you're familiar with Dick Schwartz's work, IFS, internal family systems.
A little bit, yes.
Okay. So if people have a protector part that is saying, keep off the grass, do not go here, do not, try and change the system in any way, then you're not going to want to jump in and do a Brainspotting session where you're trying to get immediate change. You would want to work with that part, that protector part, in a respectful way. So yeah, I want to get back to your question of, so there are so many different techniques out there.
Yeah.
Hundreds. How do you pick?
Right.
And so part of that would depend upon what kind of a therapist you want to be. Do you want to be more of a counselor or a coach, or do you want to work deeper under the hood? And if you want to be more of a coach or a counselor, then there are other approaches, like motivational interviewing, let's say, that are going to be more effective for what the kind of work you want to do. The kind of work that I want to do is to help people transform and heal. And it's interesting because when I was going to school, we didn't talk about healing. And we didn't talk about transformation. We talked really more about managing symptoms and limiting neurotic behavior.
Yeah.
And I've come to believe that we humans have a vast capacity to heal and to transform. Right. And that this is one of the techniques that I use that I think gets people there.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. And I think that the history of our profession is got one foot in science and another foot in what I often refer to as shamanism, which is in the healer tradition. So, one is science and objectivity and being outside, and the other is much more of a feeling of working with healing and a kind of magic, if you will, which in my mind, from a scientific point of view, includes the don't block on the word now. I'm going to block on the word. The thing that we try to avoid in medicine, that part of the person that automatically that picks up on
intuition, you mean?
No, intuition certainly is involved. Blocking on a word. So I'll move on. Yeah.
Well, but so as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the talk that you did with Betty, and that so much of what she advocates and that Jeff Zygar, teacher, advocates is following the baby thoughts, following these little moments where there's a deep connection, where you're resonating with the other person and you get this image or sense of something and you pursue it and things open up. And so, and I know what I was going to say, and that she had, I think, referenced, was it Scott Miller's research that people found psychics more helpful than psychotherapists?
Yes, I still want to look up that article. I've got to look at that because that sounds so important that I need to read the original article and be able to reference it. Yeah.
Right. So I have a little bit of trouble with that, only because it feels to a degree like people are giving away their agency to someone else when they go to the psychic and the psychic is helping them to solve their problems. They're relinquishing something. And yes, they're getting held, they're getting met, and that's really wonderful. But for me, I would want to know how we can do that. And I think Betty actually does it in her practice. How can you combine that in a way, or bring that forward in a way that allows people to take ownership for what is emerging in them? And in a way, that's what's delicious for me about Brainspotting, is that we start with an issue. The issue could be, I'm struggling so much with COVID because I'm isolated. I haven't seen my family. I feel so deprived. I'm getting so tired of Zoom. That could be an issue. And then we would say to them, so as you're talking about that, how activating is that for you on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being not at all and 10 being off the charts upsetting, and say it's a 6 or a 7. And then we invite people to notice what's happening inside of their body as they focus in on this. And it might be that they notice that their and this is different for every issue, for every person, but let's say for the sake of this discussion, your shoulders rolled forward, your breathing has gotten shallower, there's butterflies in the stomach. And then we would invite somebody to just, as you're aware of that, look to the left, look to the center, look to the right, Okay, I feel the tensing in my stomach more when I look to the right, and then that's right. So I just moved it a little bit in toward the center, and my stomach tightened even more right here. And then I would sit there with the person I'm working with and just have them keep their eyes there and notice. So it's a way of focused mindfulness where you're just noticing what happens. And it could be that sensations change. You could have images, you might have smells, you might have sounds, but then this process just evolves. And in a way, it's like a shamanistic journey.
Yeah.
Because it's except that someone outside of you isn't leading it, your system is leading it.
Well, you're leading it to some extent, right? You're asking them to, you're directing them, and you're asking them to use a rating scale. And I was thinking, well, that sounds kind of like bringing the science part back into it. But I'm not sure. But on the other hand, you do want them to be able to report what their experience is. So I can see that. The term I was blocking on before has popped up. It was the placebo response, and I see that as part of the homeostatic process that you're talking about, the self-healing. It's a further evidence of that capacity, I think, that we have built in. You look skeptical.
No. I have an interesting relationship with the concept of placebo because I think that placebo, at least in medical science, means that the pill that you've given may not have caused the response because it may be something else, but it could just be the person's belief that the pill would work. But the fact that our systems can drive that kind of change, regardless of whether it was the pill or the thought about the pill, is just extraordinary.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Right.
And that way it relates to what you're saying about the self-healing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and so it's different than the shaman with the rattle however you want to imagine the shaman standing outside of the person, calling to the gods and invoking other powers to make the transformation. Now, you're right. I agree with you that some of that could be placebo too. It could be that the person believes.
Yeah.
And then it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I think. Yeah. One of the people that I interviewed recently is Neil Gagin, who is from the School of Memory Reprocessing, right? I'm not sure if I'm remembering the right term. And he started a website of experiential psychotherapy, a whole list. As you think about it, you can find that there are a whole bunch of psychotherapies that are saying the real magic happens experientially rather than cognitively. So I see you kind of on that side of the ledger, if you will.
I am both feet and the rest of my body on that side of the ledger. And,
yes, right. Yeah.
And there isn't any, I'm not, I can't remember, there's some term about it that it has to be made here in order to be okay. I think whatever tools the therapist can bring that make the therapy experiential is phenomenal. Was it David Burns has 52 different techniques that he utilizes and teaches, and he goes through them, finding the one that works best for the person he's sitting with. And I love that concept.
Yeah.
Yeah.
52 would be a lot to go through, but I'm sure one would be guided by the interaction and their own intuition, and very quickly be able to zoom in on what would be most likely be the most appropriate.
Okay. So I have a question for you. What made you curious about Brainspotting?
Well, I've been following psychotherapy for a long time. And one of the things that I do in this podcast is to try to cover as much of the field as I can, and not just psychotherapy, but of psychology more generally.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that. And also I struck by it's I think way too reminiscent of train spotting. And I wish that I don't know, somebody else must have made this observation. I can't even remember if I saw the movie Train Spotting, but I think I at least saw part of it. And it is a very negative film, I think. Isn't it?
I'm not. I am sadly the last person that you want to ask about films. I don't know many.
Yeah, I don't think you'd particularly enjoy it. I mean, you might find some psychological dimensions in it, but as I recall, it's heroin addicted young people.
Oh,
yeah, and it's like it was an ugly kind of space that it painted, and so brain spotting, train spotting. I mean, that's. I don't know if that gets in the way anywhere. It doesn't sound, if you've got 150,000 people practicing it, it doesn't sound like it's a stumbling block. But if I were inventing it, I would think of a different term, I think. But that's just me. I didn't invent it, and I will take it as it comes.
I can remember sitting around with a group of people trying to figure out exactly what to call it. And it was, okay, so there's a spot, the visual focal point goes with a spot that in the brain that appears to link to a neural net. And
yeah, I can see how you got there, and I don't know that I have anything better.
Yeah,
I'd have to think about it, but I'm not sure I could come up with anything that's better.
Yeah.
So where do you see this going? What do you see as the future?
Well, you know, it's really interesting. There is a physical therapist who has been working with a psychotherapist, and they've developed a training program called From Freeze to Thaw, and they work very much with the body, and they're bringing, and I haven't had a chance to work with them yet. I'm queued up to take that course because I love the idea of bringing more of the body into the process.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be one of the next big steps with brain spotting.
Let's talk about trauma a bit, because clearly we are in the midst of trauma, and a lot of people are going to be suffering from the trauma that we're going through, both from COVID and from the fact, from the possible collapse of our planet, of our whole environment, of what we're used to. A lot of people are looking forward to, when it snaps back to the way that it was. And there's serious reason to question whether or not it can snap back to the way that it was. And if it can't snap back to the way it was, well, that's a pretty significant loss, unless we get a really positive vision about what's possible in the new.
Yeah.
And I know that people are thinking and working and dreaming about that. But I think there's a lot of work. There's going to be a lot of work for therapists, and how is this a practical approach for dealing with large numbers of trauma victims?
That's a really good question. So I have when I do online consultation, often we have the therapists that are in the consultation group do some self-spotting as part of the process. And that's helped a lot with what they're struggling with, related to COVID, as you're asking. That being said, I think that the solution to the issue that you're raising is so complex, that there's got to be community. There's got to be familial aspects to it.
Oh,
There
yeah.
has, and that having experts come in and do trauma processing outside of shoring up the community and shoring up the family is going to be a tiny band-aid for a gaping wound. And that we've got to look much more systemically. Brain spotting is lovely. I came across a term recently that I love, which is emotional archaeology.
Okay.
And having studied archaeology when I was in college, I think of it the fact that you don't go in with your trowel, you go in the brush, and you're clearing off the layers gently. And so that is wonderful for individual trauma. But when you're talking about collective trauma, the process, I think, of healing is very different. Then we get back to, how do we utilize the shamans? How do we utilize the community leaders? How do we identify who they are and empower them to bring us all together? And I think about I was very involved at 9/11. And the kinds of things that we did in the firehouses, the kinds of things that we did for the police, the kinds of things we did for the community at large, very much focused on shoring up those connections.
Yeah, that sounds very important work.
And so David, after Katrina, went down to New Orleans and actually did brain spotting with people at the site of their trauma, and helped people to find a new equilibrium, to find a healthy homeostasis, and to process the trauma much more quickly than they would have otherwise. So there can be a role. But you're talking about a society that's wounded, not just one community.
That's right. That's right. That's pretty major. Do you have any recommendations for people in terms of that are being impacted currently by either isolation, who are isolating, as we still pretty much are, my wife and I, even though we've both been vaccinated now? Do you have any kind of recommendations or practices that people might tap into that would help provide them with strength and confidence and whatever?
So one of the things that I remember from my training in crisis response was ritual. Coming up with meaningful rituals that you can do on a daily basis that allow you to feel connected to the earth, connected to yourself, connected to maybe one or two other people. It could be a morning cup of coffee with a couple of friends on Zoom. It might be that, especially as we're coming into spring, that you have a little garden on your balcony or on your windowsill or in your backyard that you tend to. It is, how do you create points of connection that are meaningful to your heart? Is it, do you do art? Do you do, so there's connecting in the physical realm, there's connecting to ritual, and then there's connecting to other humans. And I think all of those things on a daily basis are really important. Plus, finding out what's really meaningful to you. And for people that are trained in brain spotting or have done brain spotting, some people get up in the morning and will do a brief brain spotting session, connecting themselves, sitting and saying, okay, so I want to think of a moment when I felt truly connected. For me, it was being at Hither Hill State Park, which is one of my favorite places in the earth, and that's out on Long Island. Camped there when I was young, and just standing under the Milky Way and feeling held by the universe. And so for me, I might spend 2 or 3 or 5 minutes just stepping back into that experience, either with my eyes shut or my eyes open on a fixed position, and allowing my body to come back into some state of, I'm here now,
Yeah.
I'm okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was imagining maybe a variant, almost a kind of yoga or Tai
Mhm.
Chi, that would help to, that could be married to the theory and assumptions, et cetera, of the brain spotting. Some
So do
kind of,
you, sorry.
I have done.
So what is your favorite Tai Chi move?
Oh my goodness. I've been away from it for some years now, and I don't know that I have well, I would say it's it's good. I forget the name of it, but it's one where you're kind of doing a like a graceful kind of push hands of your own, pushing against the wrist without touching.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say it's kind of got a dance-like feeling that I like.
So if you were to just do that now, and you
Yeah.
can either do that physically or you can do that in your mind's eye, because
Uh-huh.
our bodies don't differentiate between the two, and just
Yeah.
notice what you feel.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll do it after we're off I'm sitting in a chair that's pretty confining. I've got a microphone in my face, so it's
That
not,
you do.
yeah, it's not the best setup to do it, what you're directing me towards. But after I get off, I will stand and I'll do that for a while and see what comes up.
Well, and what might be really interesting is to do it with your wife.
Yeah, yeah, I'll see if she's into that. Yeah. Well, it feels to me like we're at a good place to wind down. Is there anything that you haven't had a chance to say that you were hoping to get in here?
Well, so thank you for asking. So just as an aside, if people are interested in brain spotting, we are having our second international conference. It's going to be both online and a small number of people in Denver, July 22nd to 25th. And it's brainspotting2021.com if anyone's interested, or they can email me at spinko96@yahoo.com. And I'm happy to hear from people and answer questions.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, so you've made yourself very available. Well, Susan Pinco, Dr. Susan Pinco, I really want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
And thank you for having me, David.